century. Between the days of the Finis Belli and the coming of the first ironclads, there were numerous projects of inventors. In 1805, a Scotchman named Gillespie proposed the mounting of guns and ponderous mortars in revolving armored turrets, both in fortifications on shore and on floating batteries. 2 years later, Abraham Bloodgood of New York designed a floating battery with an armored turret. During the war between England and the United States in 1812, an American engineer, John Stevens, who was a man in advance of his time, proposed the construction of a steam-propelled warship, with a ram bow and with her guns protected by shields. He prepared a design, but failed to persuade the Navy Department that it was practical. His son, Robert L. Stevens, improved the design, made the experiments with guns, projectiles, and armor plates, and at last, in 1842, obtained a vote of Congress for the building of the Stevens Battery, a low freeboard ram, steam-propelled and armed with 8 heavy guns mounted on her center line on turntables protected by armored breastworks. The methods of the American Navy were very dilatory. Professional opinion was opposed to Stevens, whose project was regarded as that of a crank, and the ship was left unfinished for years. She was still on the stocks when the Civil War began. Then other types came into fashion, and she was broken up on the ways. The man who introduced the armor-clad ship into the world's navies was the Emperor Napoleon III, the same who introduced rifled field artillery into the armies of the world. Like other great revolutions, this epoch-making change in naval war began in a small way. What forced the question upon the Emperor's attention was the failure of the combined French and English fleets in the attack on the sea forts of Sebastopol on 17 October 1854. The most powerful ships in both navies had engaged the sea forts and suffered such loss and injury that it was obvious that if the attack had been continued, the results would have been disastrous. Some means must be found of keeping explosive shells out of a ship's gun decks, if they were ever to engage land batteries on anything like equal terms. Under the Emperor's direction, the French naval architects designed 4 ships of a new type, which were rapidly constructed in the imperial dockyards. They were floating batteries, not intended to take part in fleet actions, but only to be used against fortifications. Their broad beam, heavy lines, rounded bows, and engines of only 225 horsepower condemned them to slow speed just sufficient to place them in firing position. They were armored with 4-inch iron and armed with 18 50-pounder guns. The portholes had heavy iron ports, which were closed while the guns were reloading. 3 of these floating batteries, the Devastation, Lave, and Tonnant, came into action against the shore batteries at Kinburn on 17 October 1855, the anniversary of the attack on the Sebastopol sea forts. There was some difficulty in getting into position, as they could just crawl along and steered abominably. But when they opened fire at 800 yards at 9 a.m., they silenced and wrecked the Russian batteries in 85 minutes, themselves suffering only trifling damage and not losing a dozen men. It was the first and last fight of the floating batteries. But while in England men were still discussing the problem of the sea-going ironclad, the French constructors were solving it. They had to look not to parliamentary and departmental committees, but to the initiative and support of an intelligent autocrat. so events went quicker in France. In 1858, the keels of the first 3 French sea-going armor-clads were laid down at Toulon, and next year the armored frigate Gloire, the first of the European ironclads, was launched, and every dockyard in France was busy constructing armor-clads or rebuilding and armoring existing ships. France had gained a start in the building of the new type of warship. When the Dreadnought was launched, it was said somewhat boastfully that single-handed she could destroy the whole North Sea fleet of Germany. It might be more truly said of the Gloire that she could have met single-handed and destroyed the British Channel or Mediterranean fleet of the day. It was the moment when the tension with France over the Orsini conspiracy had caused a widespread anticipation of war between that country and England, and had called the volunteer force into existence to repel invasion. But the true defense must be in the command of the sea, and the first English ironclad, the Old Warrior, was laid down at the Thames Iron Works. Work was begun in June 1859, and the ship was launched in December 1860. She was modeled on the old steam frigates, for the special types of modern battleships and armored cruisers were still in the future. She was built of iron with unarmored ends and 4¼ inch iron plating on a backing of 18 inches of teak over 200 feet amidships of her total length of 380 feet. There was a race of ironclad building between France and England in which the latter won easily, and it was only for a very short time that our sea supremacy was endangered by the French Emperor's naval enterprise. But when the English and French fleets entered the Gulf of Mexico in 1861, our ships were all wooden walls, while the French admiral's flag flew on the ironclad Normandie, the first armored ship that ever crossed the Atlantic. Notwithstanding this fact, American writers are fond of saying, and many Englishmen believe, that the introduction of armored navies was the outcome of the American Civil War of the early 60s. All that is true is that the War of Secession gave the world the spectacle of the first fight between armor-clad ships, and the experiences of that war greatly influenced the direction taken in the general policy of designers of ironclad warships. Towards the close of the Crimean War, a Swedish engineer settled in the United States, John Ericsson, had sent to the Emperor Napoleon a design for a small armored turret ship of what was afterwards known as the Monitor type. He wrote to the Emperor that he asked for no reward or profit, for he was only anxious to help France in her warfare with Russia, the hereditary foe of Sweden. The war was drawing to a close, and for his future projects, the Emperor wanted large sea-going ships, not light draft vessels for work in the shallows of the Baltic. So Ericsson received a complimentary letter of thanks and a medal, and kept his design for later use. His opportunity came in the first months of the Civil War. In the 50 years between the War of 1812 and the outbreak of the struggle between North and South, the American Navy had been greatly neglected. It was a favorite theory in the United States that a navy could be improvised, and that the great thing would be, in case of war, to send out swarms of privateers to prey upon the enemy's commerce. Very little money was spent on the Navy or the dockyards. On the Navy list, there were a number of old ships, some of which had fought against England in 1812. There were a number of small craft for revenue purposes, a lot of sailing ships, and a few fairly modern steam frigates and smaller steam vessels depend